So, today's video is going to be about gender abolition. Alright, first of all, let's go through the content warning. This video is going to contain brief mentions about transphobia, TERFs, which is transgender exclusionary radical feminism. There we go. Bigotry towards non-binary people, and misogyny. There will be no explicit talk about these subjects, but they will be alluded to, so please use discretion if you are worried about those topics. I did not have a very easy time researching this subject. Most of the sources I could find were very radical feminist TERF-y, and I think it's unfair to only use those sources to represent gender abolition, because that's not all gender abolition is. Secondly, I'm not going to be talking about Vosh or that discourse, because not all gender abolitionists are Vosh supporters. The first thing I want to say is that I want to look at this from an anthropological point of view, as shitty as anthropology can be on certain subjects. It's very useful for understanding the importance of gender and culture and aspects of culture such as gender. I want to start off by saying that I am a transgender man. I've sort of swayed in between binary, trans man, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid. I'm not entirely... Let's just say I'm not on friendly terms with the binary, okay? So I understand the reason that a lot of non-binary and transgender people are for gender abolition. However, I would argue three things. Number one, gender abolition is a bad idea because it erases culture. And I'll elaborate on that in a minute. My second point is that gender abolition will not solve misogyny or bigotry based on sex, gender, reproductive rights, that sort of thing. My third reason is I think gender abolition is not possible without using morally questionable methods. So, starting off, gender abolition is a bad idea because it erases culture. I'm talking about individual expression and how gender allows people to have the terminology and the understanding of how to express themselves and their identity. I think that by expanding gender language and gender expression and being inclusive of non-binary people and different types of gender expression, that could be a better way to encourage inclusivity than with gender abolition. I think gender abolition would take away the ability to discuss identity. It would also, like I said, inhibit some cultural practices which are not all bad. A lot of stuff when it comes to gender is bad, and I acknowledge that. There's a lot of bigotry based on gender. However, gender is not inherently bad. Gender is instead used by bigoted people to oppress others, to exploit others. But gender in and of itself is not exploitative, it's not oppressive. Gender is a force of expression and a force of understanding oneself, as esoteric as that sounds. I think, a lot of people can understand that, I think especially trans people, non-binary people, when we talk about our experiences, even if you yourself do not fall in the binary, gender does help explain our identity. And when I'm talking about gender here, I'm talking about expansive gender, not the gender binary. The gender binary is a bad thing, but gender in and of itself is not a bad thing. There are a lot of helpful things surrounding gender. I think women's support groups are a great example of how gender can unite people, can unite victims. Of course there are problems with women's only spaces when they are transphobic, but that's a separate issue. That's not because of gender, that's because of transphobia. And I think that rather than abolishing things like women's only spaces, we should encourage inclusivity, which I think some people would say that's an oxymoron to have an exclusive space being inclusive. But what I mean by inclusive is that it includes all women, not just cis women. So that kind of gets into my second point. Gender abolition will not solve these issues of oppression and exploitation. There is more to this exploitation than gender. The patriarchal structure does not need gender to oppress women or to oppress men. There are things about patriarchy that can simply be repurposed to something else. And in fact, I think if we eliminated gender, people would kind of, at least this is my expectation, people would turn to a biological essentialist point of view with patriarchy. This is just my prediction, obviously, but if we take away gender, what do we have left? If everyone is genderless, then people are simply going to say, people with, people with, or whatever, and maybe you would argue that that's not going to happen. By gender abolition, we also mean sex abolition. Sex meaning biological sex, not reproduction. And that's a fair idea, but it is a concern that I have. The third point, and this is probably my biggest gripe with gender abolition, even though I am an anarchist and I do believe in prison abolition, I believe in race abolition, gender abolition is different. I mean, let me look at it this way. How exactly would we enforce gender abolition? Especially if you're like me, an anarchist, how would you do that? If you're a statist, maybe you would say, the state would abolish gender. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that individuals can't perform gender? They can't practice gender? They can't talk about their... I don't quite understand how this would come about. I mean, I suppose you could promote genderlessness. But that whole idea really is... I think it's very dangerous. It's a dangerous idea to promote one kind of expression, because that's basically what gender abolition would call for, is that everyone would be genderless. Yeah, you could express however you wanted, but let me put it this way. I think gender abolition, number one, is named incorrectly. Gender abolition, is so often confused with things like post-genderism, gender anarchy, inclusivity, destroying the binary, things like that. When I'm talking about gender abolition, I'm talking about people who want to get rid of the concept of gender itself. They want to have a genderless society. And I mean gender, not sex, not biological sex. They mean gender, so expressions of gender, that sort of thing. And I'm not okay with it. I mean, I think that people should have the option to not have a gender. Of course, obviously. I think that including genderlessness into expressions of gender is a much better idea than gender abolition as a whole. I believe that being by inclusive with all expressions of gender, whether that be the expression of absence of gender, I think that that's just a better system. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that gender abolition is not the best option. I don't think it's a terrible option. I don't think that people who are pro-gender abolition are bad people. I don't think that it makes you a bad person in any way. I just don't think it's the best option. I really think that instead of promoting genderlessness or the abolition of gender, inclusivity is really the key. You know, I am a little biased about this, obviously, because I am trans and I am somewhat binary. Somewhat. So, the way I express my identity is very connected to gender. And I understand that maybe that's clouding my vision of this. And, you know, I think it's important for trans and non-binary voices to be the ones talking about this. I do think that trans and non-binary voices should be the ones put center stage when it comes to gender abolition and questions of gender and how to attack the problem of bigotry based on gender. And, you know, I really wish that this subject was not dominated so much by, you know, TERF radfems and dirtbag leftists like Vosh. I wish that this was something that the community could talk about without descending into just awfulness. I also wish that when people talked about gender abolition, they did mention non-binary and transgender people. So many times when I have found some kind of gender abolition thing, you know, especially with feminist theory, they don't even mention us, which might have something to do with the time period, maybe. You know, some of these sources I found are like from the 70s, but nowadays you really do need to talk about it. You need to talk about us when you talk about gender abolition, and I really think that we should be at the heads of this. You know, we should be leading this, you know, discussion. Do I think that only trans and non-binary people can talk about this? No. I think anyone can talk about it. But however, I think that transgender and non-binary voices should be promoted and listened to. Vosh. However, if you are pro-gender abolition or anti-gender abolition, it doesn't really, it doesn't mean that you're transphobic or not transphobic or whatever. You know, this topic is really difficult, especially since so much of this is theoretical. You know, the leftist revolution hasn't exactly happened yet. So we don't really know what it's going to be like. We can guess, we can try to theorize, but at the end, this is all theoretical. And I think that we should be open to dialogue on this. And, you know, I guess I'll end the video by saying I am open to dialogue on this. You know, if you want to do your own video on gender abolition, I absolutely think you should. If you want to, you know, comment on this video with your opinion, I think you should. If you, you know, however you want to do this, I think that this should be an open forum for us to talk about. Lastly, I would like to ask, do you prefer these types of casual, non-scripted videos, or did you prefer my scripted video, like my Health Under Capitalism video, my first video? Did you prefer that, or did you prefer something like this? Are you okay with my terrible webcam? Because this is all I have access to. If you don't want to see my chubby little round face, that's okay. You know, if you do want to see it and you enjoy these types of videos, please let me know. You know, I'm just starting out and I would love to have some feedback. Yeah. Oh, and follow me on Twitter.